Winter Danger, Chapter 5. It was like nothing Caje had ever heard before either, a murmuring roar like the wind through the leaves of a sugar tree. But where were the leaves to make such a noise? The trees were as bare as his hand, except for a few oaks, which still kept their rattling dry leaves. This wasn't wind, for wind would whistle high and shrill through bare branches. The noise didn't rise and fall like wind either. It grew steadily louder, rushing toward them faster and faster. Caje didn't even pick up his gun, but sat there with a piece of meat halfway to his mouth. "Great day in the morning," Jared said softly. "Looky yonder." Caje looked down. Something was the matter with the trees on the mountainside below them. They were all full of soft gray leaves, and the leaves leaped from branch to branch and scurried through the treetops. Squirrels! Caje felt goosebumps break out on his arms and legs. He'd never seen the like of this. Every squirrel in creation was right here on the mountainside, traveling the trees. As they went, they chattered and talked. Branches bent almost to the ground with their weight, and every now and then a limb would break and send the little bodies tumbling onto the ones below, till 40 or 50 would fall from the tree like big gray persimmons. They never stopped, though. They'd run along the ground till they came to a tree and scramble up it to set off again. They kept coming and kept coming, thousands and thousands of them. As far as Caje could see, the trees were full of squirrels, a moving wave of gray fur swinging from tree to tree like riffles on water. "They're headed south," said Jared finally, but Caje couldn't say anything at all. He could only stare and stare. Who would have thought there were that many squirrels in the woods? And who would have thought they would all band together and run through the treetops like an army, waving their tails and chattering as they went? It wasn't natural. It made Cage's hair creep upon his head. Finally, they began to thin out. The noise dimmed off down the mountainside, and only stragglers remained, hurrying along 2 or 3 at a time. "Well, I'm danged," remarked Jared at last. He took off his coonskin hat and wiped his forehead. Then he put it back on and looked uneasily around. "What's the matter with them critters, Pa?" inquired Caje. "Where was they headed?" "Headed for warm country, I reckon," answered Jared, wiping his forehead again. He stared after the squirrels like he had seen a witch woman talking to the devil. "I've heard tell the beasts would go south like birds when there was powerful hard winter a-coming, but I never held with such tales before." Caje stood up and fastened his pack to his back. He waited for Jared to set out down the mountain again, but his father stayed there, rubbing his beard and looking uncertainly around. "I knowed in reason we'd have a bad season," he said, half to himself. "I said the deer got their winter pelts a heap too early, and the fur's been heavy on every varmint we've killed since long before frost." He pursed his lips. "I mind that goose we killed back on the clinch. I seen what a thick old breastbone it had. I showed it to you, recollect. And them 2 fawns back in Kentuck, where we buried your ma. I said then they'd lost their spots so young it would mean a hard winter." Caje turned his head away. He remembered. Not the fawns so much as the wasted face of his mother dying of a slow fever. The little yellow flowers his ma called Mary's gold were blooming then, and he'd made Pa dig the berry hole where there was a heap of blossoms. He'd thought his ma would like that, but the flowers would be gone now. The grass would be brown and dry, and the trees bare and desolate, just as they were here. His ma would have no cabin, or no cave, to keep her from the cold this winter. Jared stood still, running his hands restlessly up and down his rifle barrel. He was naming over all the signs he'd seen all summer that meant a hard winter ahead. Jared knew all the signs, and his eyes were sharp. He never missed a thing. But it had been Caje who'd noticed the fawns, twins, who came nosing up to the newly turned earth of his mother's grave. Little young things, and yet their spots had already faded into their sleek coats. "Nah," Jared spoke at last. We won't go on to the cave. I hate to turn back, but them squirrels was sent for a token. It's meant for us not to go on. There's something ain't natural about all this. And if all the game gets up like this and leaves the country, I don't know what we'll do for meat." He tightened the thongs that held his pack. "Them squirrels was a token," he repeated. "A man would be a fool to go on when he had it clear that he wasn't meant to. It'd be against nature." "I reckon so," Caje answered sullenly. He was glad enough not to have to go to the cave, but it angered him to think that his pa was scared of a mess of squirrels. Jared had dragged them through all sorts of dangers and hardships in the past few days and not given it a thought. Seeing his son get chased by the meanest Indians in creation wouldn't turn him back, but let something out of the way happen, a fawn with no spots, a power of squirrels running down the valley, and he turned tail like a snake-bit dog. "We'll go back to the settlements. We'll go stay the winter with your ma's folks, with your uncle Adam Tadlock on the Holston River." Caje almost dropped his rifle in astonishment. He forgot his resentment at Jared. He forgot the perils of yesterday and the long journey into Indian country. They would spend the winter in a cabin. A good, snug cabin with quilts and company, with chinking in the logs, and folks sitting close around the fire. His ma's own brother's family, Cage's own folks, that he'd not seen in his life to remember. Jared squinted up at the pale winter sun and set off up the mountainside. Caje followed. He walked lightly and easily behind his father, and when he saw clouds begin to pile up in the sky and knew it was going to rain, he didn't even care. A week later, Jared and Caje stood in a clearing in front of a cabin. A dog ran out barking, and Jared swore and swung his rifle at it. Behind the cabin, someone was chopping wood. But at the sound of the dog's barking, the noise of the axe stopped, and in a few minutes, a man came around the cabin into the clearing. He peered across the clearing. "Howdy, strangers," he called at last. "Light and set." He whistled to the dog, who came to his side and stood there looking foolishly pleased at the racket he'd made. Jared went a little nearer. "We're looking for folks named Tadlock. Reckon you'd know where they live?" Caje stood a little behind Jared, taking in the neat clearing and the cabin, built with 2 rooms and a fine rock chimney. He hoped Uncle Adam had as fine a cabin as that. "Tadlock?" the man repeated. "Tadlocks are gone. Gone to Kentuck 2-3 year back. Heard tell of some of the least ones got killed by Injuns." "Thankee," said Jared gruffly and turned away. Caje stood rooted on the spot. Gone? They'd traveled all this way, and he'd thought so much about his relatives, but it had never once entered his mind that his uncle might not live here any longer. They'd have done better to go to the cave after all. What could they do here in this settlement with cold weather set in for the winter and game scarce the way it always was around settled places? "'Less it was Adam Tadlock you had in mind," the stranger went on. "He lives about 5 mile from here. You can make it long afore candlelight. Come set a spell and tell us the news." "It was Adam we was wanting," said Jared. "Where's he live?" The man looked them up and down, as if wondering where they came from, that they had so little manners. "It's north of here. You go along the trail about 5 mile till you come to a fork with a big old scaly bark hickory right smack dab in the forks. You take the left-hand fork another mile till you come to a creek. He lives up that creek a piece. Cabin sets up on a little hill, and there's a grove of poplars growing all around the foot of the hill. You can't miss it, did you only have one eye." Jared swung on his heel and started back down the path. Caje called, "Thankee," to the man. The stranger winked at him. "Fare ye well," he answered. "Dang fool," Jared muttered. "Can't answer a question. Got to beat all around the barn afore he can go in. There's a heap more fools living in settlements than lives in the woods, for a fact." "I reckon he figured we ought to stay and visit with him a spell," Caje answered. "Tell him the news," Jared growled. "I could tell him a fine lot of news. Possums still have tails, and Injuns will still kill you, do you let 'em." Caje drew his shirt closer around him. The wind was sharp and cold. Since they had left Indian country, the days had grown steadily colder. Those clouds he'd seen as they climbed the mountains had brought snow flurries, not rain, and the ground was frozen hard underfoot. When they reached the creek the stranger had described, it was frozen except where it fell over some rocks with a little icy tinkling sound that somehow made Caje colder than ever. "Yonder's the cabin," said Jared. Caje looked up through the bare branches of the tulip poplars, still bearing the little brown shells of last year's blossoms. The cabin was a big one. Blue smoke poured from the chimney. The door was closed, and there was a shuttered window in one room. But the cabin looked firm and shut up and sort of secret. Caje hung back a little. Would the folks in the cabin welcome them in? Or would these kinfolks take a look at these woodsies and tell them to get back into the forest where they belonged?